The air in the studio was thick with anticipation. Every seat was taken, and millions of viewers tuned in from their homes. They weren't just watching another talk show. They were watching a moment. Morgan Freeman, the Hollywood icon, the voice of wisdom, the man whose words could make time itself pause, stepped onto the stage. At 86, he was as poised as ever, his presence commanding, yet calm. The audience erupted into applause. Some wiped away tears before he even spoke. His voice had narrated the essence of life itself, and tonight they were ready to listen. But something felt off. The host, Vanessa Clark, was known for her ruthless, no-holds-barred interviews, and tonight she had an agenda. With a smirk, she leaned forward. "Morgan," she began, her voice smooth but cutting, "at your age, do you ever wake up wondering if today might be your last?" The room fell silent. Smiles vanished. Morgan Freeman didn't flinch. He simply folded his hands in his lap, meeting her gaze. A storm was brewing, and Vanessa had no idea what she had just set in motion. Vanessa Clark sat poised in her chair, exuding confidence. The bright studio lights reflected off the sleek glass table between her and Morgan Freeman, casting sharp shadows on the floor. She was known for her ruthless interviewing style, her ability to unsettle even the most seasoned celebrities. And tonight, she had her sights set on one of Hollywood's most revered icons. Morgan Freeman, the man whose voice had narrated history, dreams, and the depths of human emotion, sat across from her with effortless grace. At 86 years old, he had nothing left to prove. His wisdom was etched into the lines of his face, his presence commanding, without arrogance. The audience watched, holding their breath. Sensing that this was no ordinary interview, Vanessa leaned forward, a smirk playing on her lips. "Morgan," she began, her voice honeyed but sharp, "at your age, do you ever wake up wondering if today might be your last?" The atmosphere shifted instantly. A ripple of unease passed through the audience. Even the crew behind the cameras exchanged glances. The question wasn't just blunt, it was cruel. But Morgan Freeman did not flinch. He simply sat back, folding his hands in his lap. His eyes, deep and knowing, met Vanessa's without a hint of emotion. Vanessa chuckled softly, as if her words had been harmless. "I mean, let's be real," she continued, her voice dripping with casual cruelty. "You've played God in movies, but at the end of the day, you're just a man, a very old man. What's it like, knowing your time is almost up?" A gasp echoed through the studio. In the front row, an elderly woman clutched her chest. A younger man frowned, shaking his head in disbelief. Even those who had come expecting Vanessa's cutting-edge approach were stunned. Morgan remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle. The hush in the room was deafening. Then, with the patience of a man who had seen lifetimes unfold, he leaned forward slightly. His voice, when it came, was soft, yet powerful. "Miss Clark," he said, his deep baritone resonating through the studio, "have you ever sat beside someone as they took their final breath?" Vanessa's smirk wavered. The storm had begun, and she had no idea what was coming next. A heavy silence settled over the studio. The tension in the air was palpable, as though time itself had paused, waiting for what would happen next. Vanessa Clark blinked, caught off guard by Morgan Freeman's question. She had expected him to dodge, to laugh it off, or to fire back with a witty remark. Instead, he had met her sharp-edged words with something deeper, something heavier. "Well, she started, but Morgan didn't let her finish. "I have," he said, his voice low and steady, carrying the weight of decades. "Many times." The hush in the room deepened. The audience, which had moments ago been shifting uncomfortably at Vanessa's question, was now utterly still. Even those watching from home leaned in, sensing that they were witnessing something profound. Morgan sat back slightly, his fingers interlocked. His gaze didn't waver from Vanessa's, but there was no anger in his eyes, no indignation, just a quiet certainty. "I have held the hands of dear friends as they spoke their last words," he continued. "I have watched remarkable men and women take their final breaths." A young woman in the crowd wiped her eyes. An elderly man bowed his head, his expression unreadable, yet full of understanding. Morgan let his words settle before he spoke again. "And do you know what they regret the most, Vanessa?" he asked. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, as if searching for a response. But she found none. "They never wish for more money," Morgan said, shaking his head, "or more fame, or more power." The audience held their breath. "They wish they had loved more," Morgan continued, his voice deep and rich with emotion. "Forgiven more, cherished life more." A tear slipped down the cheek of a woman in the front row. "You ask me what it feels like to be old," Morgan said, turning his gaze back to Vanessa. "It feels like a privilege." The audience erupted. Some people stood, clapping through their tears. Others covered their mouths, overwhelmed by the raw truth in his words. Vanessa sat frozen, fingers gripping her cue cards. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. Morgan Freeman had taken her question, twisted its sharp edge into something beautiful, and handed it back to her. And for the first time in her career, Vanessa Clark was speechless. The applause swelled through the studio, rolling like waves against the walls. Some audience members wiped their eyes, others simply stared, unable to look away from the man who had just turned an insult into wisdom. Morgan Freeman sat quietly, his hands still folded in his lap, waiting for the moment to pass. He had no need to bask in the reaction. He had said what needed to be said. But Vanessa Clark, she wasn't ready to back down. She shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening around her cue cards like a lifeline. The script she had prepared was slipping through her fingers, but she wasn't about to lose control of this interview. Not yet. Forcing a chuckle, she leaned forward. "Well, Morgan, that was quite the speech." Morgan offered a small smile. "That wasn't a speech, Vanessa. It was the truth." The audience murmured in agreement. A few nodded, their expressions solemn. Vanessa exhaled sharply, flipping through her notes, searching for a way to steer the conversation back on her terms. "You've had a legendary career," she said, her voice regaining its usual edge. "But let's be honest, Hollywood doesn't exactly roll out the red carpet for actors your age. People move on. They forget. Doesn't that ever bother you?" A collective hush fell over the room once again. Morgan tilted his head slightly, considering her words. Then he let out a quiet sigh and rubbed his fingers together, a familiar gesture when he was deep in thought. His gaze settled on Vanessa, not with offense, not with anger, but with something softer, pity. "My dear," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "let me tell you a story." Vanessa blinked. She had spent years interviewing politicians, celebrities, and world leaders. She was used to difficult conversations, unexpected responses, and power struggles disguised as polite dialogue. But this was something else entirely. The audience leaned forward, sensing what was coming. Morgan Freeman was about to tell a story, and when Morgan Freeman tells a story, you listen. She had tried to corner him, tried to break him down, but now she was about to learn a lesson she'd never forget. The interview wasn't just slipping from her control. It was becoming something far bigger than she had ever anticipated. Morgan Freeman sat back in his chair, his fingers gently intertwined, his expression unreadable. The bright studio lights cast long shadows across his face, accentuating the lines of wisdom etched into his skin. Vanessa Clark shifted slightly in her seat. Sensing the weight of what was about to come, she had pushed, prodded, and provoked. But she was no longer in control of the conversation. The audience, the cameras, the millions watching at home, they were all waiting for him now. "There was once a young man," Morgan began, his voice rich with emotion, full of dreams, full of life. He believed the world would always have a place for him. The room fell into a deep silence. Vanessa straightened, instinctively drawn into his words. The audience sat motionless, captivated. This wasn't an anecdote or a rehearsed answer. This was a lesson. But time, Morgan continued, has a way of humbling us. His voice was steady, yet there was something behind it. Something lived, something felt. "One day, that young man grew old," he said, his gaze sweeping across the audience, and he realized that the same world that once applauded him had moved on. They no longer saw him. They no longer listened. A woman in the third row covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. An elderly man shifted in his seat, nodding ever so slightly. Vanessa inhaled sharply. She wanted to interrupt, to regain control, but she found herself caught in the current of his words. Morgan exhaled softly, his hands resting on the armrests. But one night, as he sat by his window and watched a storm roll in, he understood something. Vanessa swallowed, her throat dry. He realized, Morgan said, pausing for effect, that even when the sky turns dark, even when the world forgets the sun is still there, still burning, still shining, even behind the clouds. A quiet sniffle broke the silence, then another. Morgan's eyes softened as he looked at Vanessa. So, my dear, he said gently, irrelevance is a label the world gives to those who have lived long enough to gain wisdom. But wisdom never fades. Vanessa sat frozen. The audience sat, changed, and the world watched, knowing they had just witnessed something they would never forget. The silence in the studio was unlike anything Vanessa Clark had ever experienced. It wasn't the silence of an awkward pause or a lull in conversation. It was heavy, almost sacred, as if every person in the room was holding their breath, afraid to disturb the moment. Morgan Freeman's words lingered in the air. Even when the world forgets the sun is still there, still shining, even behind the clouds. A woman in the audience let out a quiet sob, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. An elderly man in the front row clasped his hands together, his gaze distant, lost in memories. Even the camera crew, usually detached observers of the show, stood motionless, transfixed by the wisdom pouring from the legendary actor. But Vanessa was struggling. This was not how the interview was supposed to go. She had built her career on control, on keeping her subjects on the defensive, bending them to her will. And yet, here she was feeling exposed, as if it were her being unraveled, not Morgan Freeman. Forcing a breath, she straightened her posture and attempted to regain her composure. Well, Morgan, she said, forcing a tight-lipped smile. That was certainly poetic. She glanced down at her cue cards, searching for something, anything, to steer the conversation back into her territory. But let's talk about something a little more real. You've had an incredible career, but Hollywood isn't always kind to aging actors. Doesn't it bother you that the industry has moved on? A murmur rippled through the audience. Morgan simply smiled, shaking his head. Vanessa, let me tell you something, he said, his voice as steady as ever. I don't measure my worth by the industry's memory of me. I measure it by the lives I've touched, the stories I've told, the wisdom I've shared. Vanessa bit the inside of her cheek. He was slipping away from her grip again, turning her sharp-edged questions into moments of reflection. Morgan leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough that it felt like he was speaking only to her. You see, Vanessa, he said, the world will forget what you did. It will forget what I did. But the way we make people feel, that stays with them. Vanessa swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around her cue cards. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure she liked the reflection staring back at her. Vanessa Clark shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of the heat rising in her chest. The control she had always wielded over her interviews was slipping like sand through her fingers. Morgan Freeman wasn't just answering her questions. He was reframing them, turning her sharp provocations into moments of wisdom. She couldn't let this continue. Forcing a tight smile, she glanced at her cue cards again, searching for something that would ground her, something that would pull the conversation back into familiar territory. Then she saw it, a note scribbled in the margins, one she had planned to use as a final jab. Now, she decided, was the time to use it. She cleared her throat. That's an interesting perspective, Morgan, she said, leaning forward, trying to project authority again. But let's not dance around reality. You grew up poor. Your mother was a cleaner. Your father left when you were just a boy. Tell me, do you ever resent having to fight so much harder than most? The audience tensed. Morgan's expression didn't change. If anything, he looked almost amused. Vanessa expected a sigh, maybe a solemn nod, acknowledgement that yes, his past had been unfair, that life had forced him into struggles he never asked for. Instead, he smiled, a slow, knowing smile. Yes, he said finally, my father left. My mother worked as a cleaner. Vanessa's smirk returned. Finally, she had backed him into a corner. But then, Morgan continued, do I resent it? He shook his head. No, Vanessa, I thank them. The air in the studio grew impossibly still. Vanessa's smirk faltered. You thank them? Morgan nodded. My father taught me something invaluable, he said. He showed me exactly the kind of man I didn't want to become. A murmur swept through the audience. And my mother, Morgan continued, his voice thick with emotion. She taught me how to survive. A single tear slipped down the cheek of an elderly woman in the front row. Vanessa opened her mouth, but no words came. Morgan's voice softened. "You see, Vanessa," he said, "pain is a teacher. It either breaks us or it builds us. And I decided a long time ago I would not be broken." For the first time that evening, Vanessa Clark had nothing left to say. The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa Clark, always quick with a comeback, sat frozen, gripping her cue cards as if they were the only thing anchoring her. The audience was equally still, absorbing Morgan Freeman's words, letting them sink into the quiet corners of their minds. Morgan had done something extraordinary. He had taken his past, the struggles that many would have used as an excuse for bitterness, and transformed them into something powerful, something unbreakable. Vanessa exhaled sharply, blinking, as if trying to shake off the weight of the moment. She had expected vulnerability, perhaps even regret. Instead, Morgan had met her question with gratitude, and it rattled her. "Well," she said, forcing a chuckle, though it sounded weaker than she had intended, "I suppose that's a noble way to look at it." Morgan tilted his head slightly. "Noble?" he repeated, as if testing the word on his tongue. "No, Vanessa, it's simply the truth." She opened her mouth to respond, but he leaned forward, his voice low and steady, pulling everyone in closer. "You see, we live in a world where people are afraid to struggle," he said. "They believe hardship is unfair, that suffering means they've been cheated. But I've learned something different." The audience was hanging onto every word. Even the crew members, usually detached observers, were transfixed. "I've learned that struggle is not our enemy," Morgan continued. "It is our teacher. It is the fire that refines us, the weight that makes us stronger. And when you stop resenting it, when you embrace it, that is when you truly become free." A hush fell over the room. Vanessa swallowed. Her carefully crafted questions, designed to put Morgan on the defensive, were crumbling in front of her. But she wasn't ready to give up just yet. "That's quite the philosophy," she said, attempting to regain her footing. "But surely, Morgan, even you must feel fear." Morgan's lips curved into a knowing smile. He had seen this question coming before she even asked it. "Ah," he said, leaning back, his deep voice carrying a warmth that sent shivers through the audience. "Now that, Vanessa, is an interesting question," and the answer he was about to give would shake the world. The tension in the studio was thick enough to cut. Vanessa Clark had finally found her foothold again, or so she thought. She sat straighter in her chair, her smirk creeping back onto her lips. She had spent years perfecting her craft, pushing her guests into corners, making them stumble, and now she was convinced she had found the one thing even Morgan Freeman couldn't turn into wisdom. "Don't you ever feel afraid?" she asked, her voice measured, calculated. "You're 86 years old. You've had an incredible career, but time doesn't stop for anyone. Doesn't it scare you to know that one day all of this will be gone?" The audience tensed. Morgan didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the question breathe, let the weight of it settle over the room like a thick fog. His fingers tapped gently against the armrest, his gaze locked onto Vanessa's. Then, finally, he spoke. "Vanessa," he murmured, his voice warm yet unshakable. "Do you know the difference between fear and faith?" Vanessa blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift. "What?" Morgan leaned forward slightly, his presence alone commanding absolute attention. "Fear," he said, his deep voice resonating through the room, "is believing in the worst that could happen." He let the words settle, watching as Vanessa processed them. Then he continued. Faith is believing in the best that could happen." A hush fell over the studio. A tear slid down a woman's cheek. In the front row, an elderly man let out a shaky breath. Vanessa, who had spent the entire interview steering the conversation, suddenly felt as if she were the one under scrutiny. Morgan's voice softened, but the power behind it remained. "I wake up every morning, and I choose faith," he said simply. "Not because I don't know that my time is limited, but because I know that what I do with that time is what truly matters." The weight of his words hung in the air, like a final note in a symphony. For the first time in her career, Vanessa Clark had no rebuttal, no sharp remark, and the audience, many of whom had come expecting nothing more than another celebrity interview, realized they had just been given something far greater, a truth they would carry with them long after the cameras stopped rolling. The weight of Morgan Freeman's words had transformed the room. Fear and faith, two simple concepts, yet when spoken by him, they became something more, something felt, something understood. Vanessa Clark, once so sure of herself, sat quietly now, gripping her cue cards with fingers that had begun to tremble. She had spent years crafting questions designed to unravel her guest, to expose their vulnerabilities, but somehow, in the span of one interview, it was she who felt exposed, and Morgan Freeman, calm, composed, unwavering, wasn't finished yet. Desperate to regain control, Vanessa forced a laugh, though it came out weak. "All right, Morgan," she said, clearing her throat. "Enough wisdom for one night. Let's talk legacy. When you're gone, what do you think people will remember about you?" The audience tensed, sensing another shift in the conversation. Morgan, however, only chuckled, a deep, knowing sound that sent shivers through the room. He shook his head slowly, looking at Vanessa with something almost like amusement. "Ah, Vanessa," he said, his voice smooth as ever. "You're asking the wrong question." She frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" Morgan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough to make the entire room lean in with him. "The real question," he said, "is what will they remember about you?" The silence that followed was thunderous. Vanessa's lips parted slightly, as if searching for words, but none came. She wasn't the only one shaken. Members of the audience exchanged glances, the weight of the question pressing into them like a mirror held to their souls. Morgan sat back, giving her space, his expression as gentle as it was unyielding. "You see, Vanessa," he continued, his voice like a slow-moving river, deep and powerful, "I have spent my life telling stories, helping people feel, helping them understand, and when my time is up, I know I'll leave something meaningful behind." The audience watched, transfixed. "But you," he said, his gaze steady, "you have a powerful platform, and yet you use it to tear people down instead of lifting them up." A muffled sob echoed from the audience. Vanessa glanced down, her cue cards now useless in her hands. "It's not too late," Morgan said softly, and at that moment, Vanessa Clark realized that she had not just conducted an interview, she had lived a reckoning.